Welcome back to We Need to Talk, where I give you the tools and skills you need to love better so you can live better. I'm Darcy Sterling. There's an old saying, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I've never been a grudge holder myself, but I have felt wronged, and when it has involved a loved one, I have felt victimized, which has at times left me very resentful. Years ago, I became estranged from my brother. We were incredibly close. He was like a father to me. He helped me apply to college, taught me how to drive a car. He was a nurturer, a protector, and the person I trusted most in the world. Our falling out came on the heels of a very contentious divorce that I had just gone through, which had left me with post-traumatic stress disorder. And just as I was emerging out of that, my brother and I stopped talking. Losing my brother, it punched me right back into a spiral of trauma. I felt blindsided. The devastation that came from losing him, it brought me right back to the darkest days of my divorce. And with it came the return of night terrors, which had only just subsided. Those night terrors, they were the worst part of my PTSD because I did not sleep for 2.5 years. I am somebody who generally sleeps like 9 to 11 hours a night. It's a big problem for me. I need a lot of sleep. And for 2.5 years, I slept between 2 and 4 hours a night. I was like a walking husk of a human being. And within days of the fallout with my brother, I woke up from a night terror. So that night, I rolled out of bed. My thoughts were racing. How could my brother walk away from me at a time in my life when I needed him so much? Why was this happening to me? And with each additional thought, I felt myself becoming more and more angry. So knowing that there was no sleep in my near future, I went to the dining room table, I opened my laptop, and I started researching how to feel better, beginning with how to resolve anger. I found lots of research on the health consequences of untreated anger, which ironically just made me more pissed off. But something else came up as well, the word forgiveness. Now, bear in mind, the rupture with my brother resulted in me losing the only structure of a family I had because I had just ended my own family with my ex-husband. And it was on the heels of my coming out. It's a time in your life where you really need your family. So I'm sitting there looking at my blinking cursor, flashing on the word forgiveness, and I am thinking, never. But I kept reading, mostly because I needed the distraction. And up came the name Robert Enright. Enright is a psychologist who created a theory called forgiveness therapy. In it, he posits that forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's not about cutting the other person slack. It's a life raft for people who feel wronged, so they don't have to live the rest of their lives drinking poison, expecting the other person to die. When I found him that night, Enright had just published a book called Forgiveness is a Choice. The book touted a process through which the reader could rid themselves of anger through forgiving the other person, but without having to reconcile with the other person, the person who wronged them. Zero obligation to make up, which for me was everything. So even though a part of me was quite cynical, I committed that night to following Enright's program. And over time, his process, which was very methodical, began shifting things inside of me. Each concept built on the one before, and I could see the logic in why it was working. When I came out the other side, I was measurably better. Like I literally measured my capacity for forgiveness before I started his program and again afterwards, and it was significantly improved. In the years since, I have taken lots of clients through his process of forgiveness, and most of them have had similar results to me. And today I'm joined by the theorist himself, Dr. Enright. Thank you for joining me. I'm curious, what led you to specialize in forgiveness?
Well, the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Educational Psychology hired me to study moral development because I'm in the human development area, and they wanted a specialist in moral development. Well, when they hired me a long time ago in 1978 to study moral development, everybody was obediently studying how children, adolescents, and adults think about justice. and how they become more complex in their thinking about justice. And I was an obedient academic. I did the same thing. I had grants and publications and got tenure. And I was a fair-haired academic because I was being obedient to what the norms told me I could do. And I awakened one day to ask myself what I call a very dangerous question. Who am I helping with my research? And the answer was just about nobody. All I was doing was writing for academics, as everybody else was. So I have an expression, I threw all of my research over a cliff, which I did, and I've never gone back and read any of that work on justice. But I'm in a publisher parish university, of course. It's a big deal to publish, and I didn't have a new topic in moral development. And so I asked a reverse of justice. What happens when you've been thrown down into the pit of injustice? How do you get out of that?
That was a word that really struck me in the reading that I felt quite understood and validated. Now you're bringing me back 15 years ago, 12 years ago, and the word injustice felt so validating and cathartic, quite frankly.
To a lot of people who sometimes don't even think about that and don't even realize how deeply they've been hurt. And so when I thought about this idea of injustice, my question is, how do they climb out? And forgiveness kept coming up for me. And I thought, well, I'm in the helping professions. Surely there's a lot of published research on this topic. So we had no Google or any kind of internet search back then, which was 1985 then. And so I actually had to walk all the way to the library and ask the librarian to do a computer search of the literature for me in her big mainframe computer. And she came back about a half hour later, a little round-shouldered with a blank sheet of paper, and said, there's no published studies that are empirically based on person-to-person forgiving. And I had a friend at another university who did the exact same search, came up with nothing. So I thought, well, I think I've got a career here. And so I started talking to graduate students, and within probably a month, I had graduate students from Greece and Taiwan and Saudi Arabia and Korea and the United States, all sitting around together in what we call the Friday Forgiveness Seminar, trying to figure out what is forgiveness, how do you go about it, and what happens when you do. And that started in 1985. We had the first empirically based study published in 1989. That's how long it took, about 100 years in the social sciences, especially psychology. And now we have thousands of people studying the topic of forgiveness because it works.
So you yourself didn't need to use it personally. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying I didn't need to use it until I started studying forgiveness. Then a firestorm happened. Academics were very uncomfortable with me breaking through the norms of what they said was reasonable to study. And people thought I had lost my mind. Some of my students were told that, one in particular came to me, and she was told to not work with me anymore because I ruined my career, and she'd never get a career in academia working with me on forgiveness. And so this firestorm surprised me because here I'm trying to help people, and others are saying, don't you dare go there.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of my questions. How did the field initially respond to you? And I'm guessing unkindly and unacceptingly.
Very, very resistant. Even all my grants dried up. My very first attempt at a grant in forgiveness was on trying to help prisoners first forgive those who've abused them to get rid of their rage. And maybe then they'd be more open to corrections, to really improve psychologically and in their empathy. And I applied for a grant, and a world famous experimental psychologist interviewed me for the grant, said, a great idea. I'm going to rate you number one. I thought this is going to be easier than I thought. A month later, I got the rejection letter. And so I called him and said, you rated me number one and I got rejected. I'm just wondering what's happening here. And he said very angrily to me, Dr. Enright, you embarrassed me. And I said, how did I embarrass you? He said, I went into this meeting of all the people on this board, and I praised your work, and they were incredulous. They were angry, and they said, give Enright money to help prisoners forgive after what they've done. Why they need to be seeking forgiveness from us. Rejected. And it didn't get
Wow.
any better from there. In other words, I had to practice forgiving because I study forgiveness.
That is so paradoxical and ironic all in one mouthful. Wow.
And we just had, it took 30 years, but we just published a study in maximum security corrections with men who have been terribly abused in childhood. You know what happened? They came to us clinically angry, anxious, and depressed. And after 6 months of forgiveness therapy, they went to normal levels of anger, anxiety, and depression. Their empathy went up toward other people. Some of them went to medium security because they're less of a threat. And 6 months later, they still had that same healed profile. So it took 30 years, and I was rejected at least, I'd say, about 5 times for grants on this. And I think it's a cutting edge idea for corrections, but even that's still a fight to get people to see it.
You know, there is something so counterintuitive about the idea of forgiving someone who
Yep.
wrongs you as a way of easing your own pain. It feels like you're suggesting that the other person should be let off the hook in some way.
Right.
I can imagine that a lot of the outrage that you received was because people could not hold dialectical thought in their head. Two things that didn't seemingly shouldn't go together actually need to.
Yeah. In fact, what really happened is they were misunderstanding what forgiveness is. And I don't blame them because how often do we have discussions of forgiveness in families, in societies, in workplaces? Hardly at all. And
Mhm,
so I find is as soon as we talk about forgiveness, people think about lying down and have people walk on their face and
mhm.
say, do with me what you will. I forgive you for being mean to me. Continue to be mean to me. But that's excusing, not forgiving. What we're actually doing is we're offering mercy. We're offering a hand up to a person to be a better person, actually. And we're giving of ourselves in the hope that that's happening. But we don't excuse. And another thing we don't do that people just don't understand is we don't throw justice under the bus. Forgiveness and justice can grow up together. So if someone is abusing you, you can forgive by trying to be good and offer mercy to that other person, while at the same time asking something of that person in terms of justice. And if you forgive from the heart and you're not hate filled, how you ask, your tone, that for which you ask likely will be more balanced and reasonable. You may get to that point where the person understands rather than each one throwing bombs at each other, so to speak, with verbal assaults and deep looks of pain. So forgiveness and justice growing up together might end up appeasing people, and helping relationships.
I have to tell you, using myself as an example in your experiment of forgiveness and its efficacy, that was more than a decade ago that I went through your process. And 2 years ago, my mother died. And it
Oh,
brought me and my siblings together again for the first time since we had the rupture and we became estranged from each other. And man, that held true. I was really concerned about the feelings that might come back up in me. I had struggled with rage for years before your process. That was the beginning of healing my rage. It began with forgiveness, with your process.
yeah.
And I couldn't have done the deep healing that I did if I hadn't started there. But what was amazing was I literally got to go back to the petri dish to see how I would respond or feel. I would always respond appropriately because I'm a therapist. I teach emotional management skills all day, every day. So I knew I was going to keep myself together. But when
Yeah.
I was back face to face with my one brother in particular, who I missed and continue to miss, I was okay. I wasn't angry. And that was astounding to me. It was
Yeah.
literally like a 10-year later, let's see if this work stuck. And it did.
Hmm. Wonderful. See, it stays with you because what
Mhm.
forgiveness does is it takes away little by little that unhealthy anger in the heart. And as that happens, it really is a cure for that. So that unhealthy anger melts. And it does, and it can occasionally come back, to a degree. But the more you forgive, when it comes back, it doesn't come back as intensively or as long. And in essence, as one person said to me, my anger used to control me. Now I'm in control of my anger. And that then can last the rest of your life. And if you don't do that, you know what lasts the rest of your life? That built up, pent up anger, that unhealthy anger that can bring people down to deep unhappiness and even bad health.
Yeah, for sure. That was a lot of the information that I found that night that I woke up and stumbled upon your work. I first was inundated with the health consequences of untreated anger, which ironically just made me more pissed off. I was like, you don't say that I'm going to have high blood pressure and that I'm going to have heart problems and that, my immune response is in overdrive. And I knew all of those things. I get that a lot of people don't. I'm curious, how does forgiveness reduce anger?
Yes. Well, what tends to happen is that if we don't have the medicine of forgiveness, let's say, the anger not only can stick around, but grow. Anger is a very unwelcome guest in the human heart. And what actually happens when you forgive, I use the term you widen the lens of who the other person is. You have a wider angle lens in which to view that other person, where you deliberately go on a journey where you try to see the other person as more than the injustices against you. You begin
So
to,
hard to do. That
well,
is
it is.
so hard
That's
to
right.
do.
But you know what? Living with that unhealthy anger is also hard to do. So, unfortunately, when we've been treated unjustly by others, we either live with the pain, like a trick knee that's been damaged, or we live with the pain of hitting the forgiveness gym and becoming forgivingly fit. And that's
Mm.
painful, but it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a will to say yes to it. And what's happening is when you start seeing the other as possibly a wounded person, and that's why the
Mhm.
person the truck on you, and you begin to see that this person is more than what happened to you, you see that this person has built in or inherent worth. Why? Because this is a person who is special, unique, and irreplaceable. Never another human being like this person before. And this person has human qualities like you do. If the person's cut, there's going to be bleeding. The person needs good nutrition, adequate sleep. The person's going to die one day, and so will you, so will I. And you say, I have a lot more in common with this person than I thought, including woundedness. And when you see that, that begins to take away some of the anger, and in its place starts very little, there's a little drip in the heart of compassion. And compassion is willingness to suffer along with others. So, what we're really saying when we're forgiving is this: I am willing to approach this person who is wounded, who has inherent worth, who shares common humanity with me. And I'm going to try and reach out to this person, person to person. That is counter to anger. That actually starts reducing the anger. Then, when you go to the person for the other's sake, because it's a moral virtue, as is justice and kindness and patience, and that's a moral virtue is giving of others for their good. So when you give to the other for the other's good, that also counters anger. And so you're no longer quite so angry because your heart is now starting to fill with compassion, not because of what the person did, but in spite of that, because you're seeing a wounded person who has worth, and there's more to this person than I have seen. And maybe I can help patch this person up if we can't, at least if we can't patch up the relationship, which maybe we can.
One of the parts of your process was made clear to me very early on, because I probably wouldn't have made it through chapter 1 of the book,
Mhm.
is there is no obligation to repair, to
Right,
make up with the other person. You can actually do this yourself to
right,
save yourself.
right. Right. See, and that's why I say forgiveness is a choice. It's really up to you, not up to the other. And if you wait for the other to apologize, you're giving great power over your own well-being until the person utters three little words, I am sorry. Why would we want to give the other that kind of power? So we can go ahead, decide to be merciful to the other, reach out in the hope of change in the other and maybe a change in the relationship. It might not come, but in giving this with the wider angle lens, with the advent of some compassion, your anger will go down regardless of what the other does. The other might reject your overture of forgiving and say, I did nothing wrong. You're overly sensitive. That's another, by the way, point of forgiving. If the person rejects your overture of a great gift, you can forgive the person for even that. But at the very least, you no longer let that person have custody of your heart.
That's very heavy. And what was interesting to me is that I felt like I fell into this cohort of people who was not intending to try and repair the relationship. So I wasn't getting the benefit of that. I knew that from the outset. I knew there was going to be no attempt at repairing. And yet, I would imagine that that would put me in a pool of subjects that so you don't get that added benefit. So then it's really we're just isolating your process.
Mhm.
We're just isolating how effective your process of forgiveness is on how I feel. And I can tell you, I also measured my depression, anxiety, and stress. I used the
Oh,
DOS for
oh,
that at the beginning of it. I mean, I'm a dork. I have a PhD. I'm going to measure everything.
good.
Um, and my scores on that were more significant than on the forgiveness meter, because I didn't start forgiving because I wanted to be more forgiving. I actually thought I was a very forgiving person. It turns out I was wrong. Um, my pretest score was not anything that I wanted to announce, although I did blog about it, and I blogged about the whole process so that I started the process exclusively to feel better, selfishly.
Sure. No, no, that's not selfish. It's honestly not. If you trip and fall and you sprain your ankle, is it selfish to go into the doctor's office to get a wrap on that or get an x-ray to see if something's broken? Self-care is not selfishness. You see, there's a difference between why we're forgiving and what we're doing when we're forgiving. And if you say, I'm hurting inside and I need to heal, that's the why of it. But the what of it is you then start trying at least to see the other person as more than what happened. You give yourself time to see the inherent worth of the other. You give yourself time to let the compassion grow toward the other. In each case, you see, you're widening your lens toward whom? Toward the other. Compassion toward whom? Toward the other. That's what forgiveness is. It's reaching out deliberately to the one who hurt you, but then you might be the one who heals. And there's nothing dishonorable about the why answer to the why question. I'm hurting and I need to heal.
You keep mentioning reaching out to the other, and for me, that would have been a roadblock to the process. Do you now request or strongly suggest that people who follow your protocol reach out to the other, or is it still the kind of thing where you leave it up to the individual?
And when I say reach out to the other, I don't necessarily mean behavior and behavioral.
Got it.
That's one part of the process, but that's leading to reconciliation.
Hmm.
If the other's a danger to you, the reaching out is how you think about the other.
Uh-huh.
It's reaching out knowing you're not excusing. It's reaching out to the other to try and see the other as a person. You're not getting together behaviorally, but what's happening is in your mind and heart, you are rehumanizing the other. You
Yeah.
are reconstructing who the other is. That's what I mean by reaching out. And you can reach out in terms of your thinking, you can reach out in terms of your feeling, And then you may or may not reach out in terms of your behavior if, in fact, the person's a danger. But you know what? You still can reach out in a behavioral sense if you cannot reconcile by reaching out to other family members and say something kind about the person. Or you can reach out to a charity and donate in the name of that person a little bit of money. You're behaviorally reaching out, but not directly to the person, because you have to watch your back. Why? Because forgiveness and justice should grow up together.
You know, the idea that forgiveness is actually a decision, it's a choice and not an emotion, is also something that may be hard for people to wrap their heads around. Until I stumbled upon your work, I always expected forgiveness to be an emotion that I would experience, and only then could I repair, or
Well,
only then could I change my cognitive framework around the injustice that I thought, that I felt happened.
mhm. Yes. Well, see, when you think about the holism of forgiveness, the entire package, it includes thinking, feeling, and behaving. But feeling usually doesn't come first, because remember, you're bumping up against the anger. And it's very hard to feel a softened heart when you are really wrapping that heart into stone because you're so angry. So that's why we start with thinking. And we do make a decision that I want to walk this path. I want to be merciful. And I want to see the person more broadly than what the person did to me. Because it's easier to think than to feel. If I said to you right now, think of a pink elephant on an orange tree, you can do that. But if I say now, feel great feelings towards someone who wounds you, it's probably not going to come. And so we start with thinking about the person. Then slowly comes a softening of the heart as the anger melts away. Okay, slowly, little by little. It might not all go away, but you're now in control of the anger. Then you decide, do I want to fold in behavior toward this now? Directly toward the person, or maybe a kind word about the person to another, or as I said, a charitable donation. See, so you can still behave and not interact with the other.
And it's interesting. It's a little like cognitive behavioral work, where we know it's so much easier to behave your way, and then your feelings will change as you amass evidence that the behaviors aren't hurting you, rather than waiting for your feelings to change so that you can then shift your behaviors. And that was a piece of your work that I really appreciated. Are there situations where forgiveness is not appropriate or advisable?
There are situations where some people definitely cannot go there right now and will not go there, and we need to respect that. We should not condemn a person for not being able to choose forgiveness now, because forgiveness is not a demand in any society. It's not a law. You're not going to be arrested if you don't forgive. I like that, because it's entirely up to you. But you probably, Darcy, could not mention an example of a huge injustice that I don't know of at least one person who has forgiven. Here's two examples. Marietta Yeager, Jaeger, lost her dear daughter Susie to an abduction and murder when they were on vacation in Montana. At first, Marietta said, I could have strangled this man with my bare hands and a smile on my face. But she saw that was destroying her family because of the unrest that was now visiting the family. She decided to forgive. She actually fought against the death penalty for this man and even visited him in prison.
Wow.
Yes, and not everyone would do that. And she's sometimes disrespected for doing so because others wouldn't. So we have to respect those who would. We have to respect those who would not as persons, because that's their decision. Eva Moses Kor, Kor, is in a documentary film called Forgiving Dr. Mengele. She was one of the twins in the twin experiments in Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II. Her twin sister Miriam died because of these experiments, and she ended up, with her own free choice, forgiving Dr. Mengele and other Nazis, because she said, this is the only way for me to live. I want to live in harmony with the world. And she would then talk with high school students about forgiving those who've tripped them up in life. And she wasn't very popular for her decision. But again, she's not condemning those who didn't forgive, nor should we forgive her for forgiving. Let's let people have the freedom to decide for themselves. So are there situations where no one should forgive? No, there are not such situations. But there are situations where some people will, some people won't, and either way could be controversial. Let's let each person decide for that person's self.
Well, I just love that. Obviously, that's beautiful, and I wish more people could live and let live. Can you give an overview of how the process of forgiveness works? Like, what is the path?
Well, our path is only one of probably many, but ours is scientifically validated to work. As you had said, your depression, for example, got better. And
Anxiety as well, and stress.
Yep, and I talked about the men in maximum security corrections. So here's the pathway. It's called the process model of forgiveness, and it's in the book you mentioned, Forgiveness is a Choice, and a couple of other self-help books I've written. And they're what we call 4 phases. The first one is the uncovering phase. And what that is to uncover the effects of what happened to you. We don't go back and scrutinize the injustice and open up the wound again. But we look at what we've been on in terms of the pathway of pain. And oftentimes people see excessive anger, which can then lead to the excessive anxiety and depression if you live with this unhealthy, large amount of anger for a long time. And so we look at that and we see a common physical effect, which is fatigue. And we see oftentimes the person compares the self with the other and says, you know, this person got away with a lot and I'm hurting. And that intensifies the pain. And that's another effect.
Yeah.
And yet another effect in the uncovering phase is what I call the worldview, where the person becomes rather pessimistic about relationships and about people. So if someone has a bad partnering relationship, there's a tendency for the worldview to say no one can be trusted in a relationship. Right. And so the generalization of the negativity is what we call the worldview, and we examine all of these effects. And the person oftentimes is surprised and says, you know, I'm living with a lot more pain than I realized. They might come for therapy because they're annoyed or they're restless and they see there's a lot more there that's opened up. And again, we're not looking at the injustice, we're looking at the effects of the injustice that might be here 20 years later. That leads to the decision phase, 2 to 4. The decision phase is this. Well, if you're hurting this badly, we have an actual program, a therapeutic program, a forgiveness program that could help you to heal. Would you be interested in trying it? It's called forgiveness, and you'd be reaching out to the other. And we give the definition of forgiveness. You've been treated unjustly. You're going to try and get rid of resentment toward that other person. You're going to try to offer goodness of some kind, better thoughts, feelings, and possibly behaviors, in terms of offering kindness, respect, generosity, or even love, if in fact that could be rekindled. And I don't mean it necessarily in a romantic sense, but in a caring for one another. And you won't be excusing, you won't be forgetting completely, unless it happened again. You may or may not reconcile, we say in the decision phase, and you won't stop seeking justice. Do you want to try it? Usually people say, well, I'll try it, but I'm skeptical because it sounds a little wacky that you're telling me this is in the realm of mercy toward the person who hurt me. It doesn't feel right, but you know, when they've tried everything under the sun, people oftentimes give it a try. Right? So then we enter the work phase. That's hitting the forgiveness gym. It's becoming forgivingly fit. And we start with thinking. We start with the personal perspective and we ask this. Is that person wounded? Was that person wounded as a child or an adolescent or as in adulthood? You know, sadly, Darcy, most people can answer that question because people who hurt us the most, usually we know well. Yeah. It's not the stranger who really hurts our heart. It's usually those with whom we should be in a good relationship, and that's why it hurts the most. So they can answer the question about being hurt and the other being hurt and being wounded, and they know the history, or they can at least ask relatives and friends to get to know the wounding history of the other. Then that's called the personal perspective. Then we hit the global perspective, where we see the humanity in the other, the shared humanity. And then only if a person has a spiritual belief do we go to what we call the cosmic perspective. And it's only if a person isn't just simply grounded in the materialism of the world. Let's say, as an example, someone's Jewish. We would ask this question. Well, in the first book of your scriptures, which is Genesis, it says and repeats itself, everybody is made in the image and likeness of God. Do you believe that? Well, sure, I believe that. The person might say, it's right there. So were you made in the image and likeness of God? Well, yes, I am. Well, okay, well, drum roll, please. And this might take months. Is the person who hurt you made in the image and likeness of God? And people usually say, oh boy, I wish I didn't know that. And so it's a hard issue. But when you put the personal, global, and cosmic perspectives all together, you see a wounded person who shares humanity with you, who shares a perspective of made in the image and likeness of God. And what does that do? It softens the heart, which makes possible empathy and compassion, which starts lowering your anger level. And only when a person is strong enough in the forgiveness, Jim, of doing these kind of thought experiments with the softened heart, do we ask the person to stand in the pain, bear the pain. Hospice does that when you're grieving. They say, lean into the pain, don't run from it. And the reason we say bear the pain is so you don't end up throwing the pain back to that person or to others who don't deserve it. Because if you're fuming because of what happened in work today and you go home and kick the cat, that's not fair to the cat. Or if you go home and yell at your partner or the kids, that's not fair because they don't deserve it. But standing in the pain shows you that you're stronger than you thought you were. And that's one of the paradoxes of forgiveness. As I stand in the pain begins to leave. And only when the person's strong enough to stand in the pain do we ask them to fulfill the nature of forgiveness, which is a moral virtue. Can you give a gift to the other of some kind? And that might take months to the person to get there. And that might be the kind word about the person to others, or charitable donation if you can't deal with the person, or even going to the person and taking a risk and say, with a softer heart, you hurt me when you do this. And I'm wondering if we can meet person to person on this. And again, you're possibly risking rejection from them. But if you're not ready for that, give the gift indirectly by the kind word. Then we hit the discovery phase. Here we find new meaning and purpose to our life. One gentleman in corrections said to me, I'm never getting out of prison, but now I have a new purpose in life, which is to help my cellmates to overcome the abuses that have been dumped onto them and help them to heal. And that's who I am now. So he has a new meaning and purpose in life. And then in this discovery phase, near the end of the forgiveness journey, we see the second paradox. As you give to the other who hurt you in this way, you are the one who is healed. So as you turn the light away from yourself, which is traditional therapy, if I come to you because I'm anxious, we'll talk about my anxiety and situations of my anxiety. But forgiveness therapy turns the light away from me and toward the one who hurt me. And as I do that kind of work and become more forgivingly fit, I am the one who is healed. And that's not expected, because in the giving to the other, you'd think, I'm never going to heal. But in that giving, our science shows you heal well and for a long period of time.
Yeah, it reminds me very much of fellowship in 12-step programs. There were similarities
Yes.
in your process to the 12 steps.
Right.
And I saw the logic in it every step of the way. My cynical, resistant part of me that felt quite protected by the anger also at the same time wanted to be rid of the anger, was really, really measuring the efficacy at every step, and I couldn't deny it. I wouldn't have advanced from one phase to the other if I had not seen dramatic change and in a felt sense. It was not cognitive.
Yeah, and again, that's usually surprising to people. And see, what's interesting is when we do forgiveness therapy and someone's angry, we don't focus on that anger. We uncover it in the uncovering phase, first to four phases. But then where does the work actually occur? In reaching out to the other in terms of thinking, then eventually feeling with compassion, behaving by standing in the pain, and giving the gift. So we do thinking, feeling, and behaving toward whom? Toward the one who hurt us.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the focus is on the other, and I am the one who heals as the client. That's what still continues to amaze me on forgiveness therapy, having been in the field of the science of forgiveness now for 38 years.
For much of the time that I've brought clients through forgiveness work, I have done it very much rogue. I did not know that there was an actual manual that you have since published on forgiveness therapy. I walked people through the book because that's the only way I knew how to do it. How can therapists integrate forgiveness into their own practice, and what do you want them to look for as an indication that forgiveness can possibly help their client?
The very first thing is to make sure that the helping professional knows exactly what forgiveness is and what it's not. It's a moral virtue where you give mercy to the other, where you have been treated unjustly by another person and you deliberately get rid of resentment and offer goodness. The mental health professional has to know that. The mental health professional has to know we're not excusing, we may or may not reconcile, and we're not going to let people walk all over our face. Unless they know that, they're going to go down a wrong path with the client, because they might think forgiveness is, oh, just let it go, okay? Or just try to get rid of your anger and relax and eat potato chips on your couch and watch a good movie, and the anger will lessen. Well, that's true, it probably will until you get up again. And so we're talking about cure for anger rather than temporarily masking it, okay? And so once the person realizes all of this, then I would recommend taking a look at my professional manual for the mental health professionals, published by the American Psychological Association, called Forgiveness Therapy. And that will give them a deep, deep dive into forgiveness. And then examine one of my 3 self-help books that have been shown through science to work. Forgiveness is a Choice, you mentioned it. Another, you'll hear a title of this that goes deeper than Forgiveness is a Choice, called The Forgiving Life. That's where you try to wipe away all of the resentments from all the people who ever hurt you, even your 6th grade volleyball coach who benched you. And you might have forgotten that, but you're still not feeling so great about yourself because of the benching. So you wipe the slate clean in The Forgiving Life. And the third one, this is the one we used actually in the maximum security correctional institution, published not by APA, American Psychological Association. Those were the first 2. The third one is called 8 Keys to Forgiveness by Norton in New York. And so that was also shown to be quite effective.
Yeah. And what are the signs that the therapist who is familiar with what forgiveness actually is should look for in their client to assess whether or not that's an appropriate treatment for them?
Do 2 things. First, examine the effects. In other words, is the person angry, anxious, depressed, okay, have a very negative worldview? And this is the biggie. Does this person have something in the past that could have been 20 years ago where there was a serious injustice against you and you're still not healed from that? And see, that's what oftentimes is missing in traditional psychotherapy, because it's an act of goodness. If I'm your client and I come to you and I'm anxious, you focus on me and you focus on my anxiety and you focus on my current environments and what brings it up. But the mental health professional rarely will ask the question, what happened to you 20 years ago that crushed you?
Well,
That-
the irony here is that we are trained to do assessments before we start work with people. And I have been in and out of my own therapy for 20 some odd years. And I don't think once I have been given an assessment. And if I have, forgive me, whoever the therapist was, but I don't think I ever have. And I don't think I know. I have never in 27 years had a client who came to me who did not get a full 3-hour assessment, sometimes much longer than that. So I think it's beholden on us as clinicians. I'm pointing at myself here. The therapists should know what in the client's life
Right.
is informing, is at the root. I mean, there's no labs that we can run on a client to know for sure that this problem today can be traced back to this injury in 3rd grade, but it's easy enough to ask, and people don't do it often enough.
Agreed. And see, when you say assessment, Darcy, we have to broaden the term so we know that it's not just assessment of my current state of anger or anxiety or depression or self-esteem or hope today, but what has happened to me in the past. We need a history of
Yes,
the injustices against the
I
person.
absolutely, but it never occurred to me that a therapist might not know that an assessment is a historical journey that you take.
It is. That's what it is. See, and to show you how important this is, when we assessed 107 men in maximum security corrections, 90% of them had very grave injustices against them in childhood or adolescence that would make you weep. Okay, one man was sexually abused for such a long time, he said, I was so angry I could kill. So he was taking out his inner torment on other people. And where did he end up? Okay. And so 90% of them had grave injustices against them. And guess what? Over 40% of them never told anybody about this ever until we asked. And when you put yourself in the shoes of them who've been gravely unjustly treated and they're silent, and it's the only way they're dealing with it is in their own heart, I wonder how they can live.
100%.
You see, and then they end up displacing it onto others. And then traditional corrections rehabilitation is to try to get them to stop their behavior. But if they're enraged, they're not going to listen to that yet. That's why I think we need forgiveness therapy and screening for that. And in this case, in this place, I was in 90% of the people would have qualified. Okay. Get them to forgive first, then give them the traditional treatments where they might be willing to stop their behavior. But without curing their hearts that are enraged, traditional ways of trying to rehabilitate aren't going to be that effective. And see, we can see it with the recidivism rates. Recidivism is going back into crime once you've been released, and those rates are high in Europe and the United States.
Because all we're doing is telling them there will be a consequence for behaving in accordance with your feelings in the future. We're not helping to change the feelings for the future. In fact, we put them in an environment in which those innate instincts are going to be imperative for the person to survive the prison.
Good point. That's right. See, you can't show weakness in a prison. See, when I talk to the gentlemen in prison, oftentimes some will let everyone leave, and the person will look over his shoulder and whisper to me, how do I engage in self-forgiveness? Because I can't live with myself because of what I've perpetrated on others. So then we talk about self-forgiveness, which is, by the way, harder to do than forgiving others. We tend to be harder on ourselves. But if you've walked the path of forgiving with others and you've widened your lens toward them and you know the pathway, you can then widen your lens toward yourself. You are more than your injustices against yourself and others. You are a human being and you're more than that. And you can start developing slowly compassion toward yourself, bear the pain so you don't self-subvert, and be kind to yourself. You can. The difference between self-forgiveness and forgiving others is if you've hurt others in the process of hurting yourself, go and seek forgiveness from them. So self-forgiveness usually involves the component of seeking forgiveness to repair the damage done to others. And you can do that, and you can get this kind of relief from self-loathing, which is not a way to live.
Right. We're recording this in March of 2024. It's not even 6 months since October 7th happened in Israel. My mind can't help but zoom in and zoom out on the potential macro implications of this, particularly in the wake of Israel's response to Gaza and the Palestinians. I've heard repeatedly from thought leaders that all Israel is doing is creating another generation of people who are going to feel morally outraged because they're undergoing unimaginable war situations and injustices themselves. And then where does this craziness ever end? Is there a macro implication for your work?
There is, in fact, a macro implication for the work that we call group forgiveness. And I'm very, very, very frustrated in this area for this reason. I'm an egghead academic. You have the PhD, so you would understand. So I read everything I can about this macro level. And in the history of the world, everything I've been able to read, never has there been an attempt to look at justice and forgiveness in the peace movement together, conflict zone to conflict zone. Never, ever. And so what we have to do is start folding in the possibility of including forgiveness there, as hard as that sounds, just like we're doing in corrections, okay? But again, everything is about justice, dialogue, repairing roads, repairing the infrastructures that have been bombed, giving money. But what about the hearts that have been gravely damaged? And in fact, we are getting ready to go into Israel with this very theme that you're talking about. We have a team set up already. And what we're doing is this. We are not, absolutely not, talking about Israelis forgiving the Palestinians or the Palestinians forgiving the Israelis at all, because it's too soon. The wounds are too fresh. It would be totally uncalled for at this point, because we need a time, all of us, when we've been treated gravely unjustly, to have a period of anger. Mm-hmm. The point is to not be angry when you forgive. The point is to be angry at first, because it shows you're a person who should be treated fairly. But then don't let the anger take up residence in the heart for the rest of your life. And what we're about to do in Israel is work with families that choose to do so, to forgive within the family, to forgive within their own community. Because see, now there's a real serious possibility of displacing their stress onto their loved ones. And if they can just look within their own family, within their own community, and practice forgiving there, it will be a guard against the toxic anger. And it would be the same thing in Palestine, but we haven't been invited in there quite yet, but we're totally open to it. And grow in your forgiveness, like the forgiving life. Make it part of your life. Make it part of practicing forgiveness to such a degree that Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, says, if you keep practicing a moral virtue, you eventually learn to love it. Learn to love that forgiveness by building up your forgiveness muscle with the family, with your own community, and only eventually, and I don't know how long this would take. It could take a decade. I have no idea, because it's never been tried in the history of the world. Maybe groups of Israelis, the Jewish people, I'm saying, because of course we have Arabic people in Israel. I go there a lot, by the way. We do work there. And maybe the Jewish people might be ready, who have practiced forgiveness and grown in it and are forgivingly fit, might be willing to meet with Palestinians who've done the exact same thing within their own community. You see, restorative justice focuses on dialogue, but I say, yes, heal the human heart first and then dialogue. Because if we're sitting together and you hate me and I hate you, our dialogue isn't going to go very far. We might be civil with one another, especially when the cameras are rolling.
Yes.
We go away from each other and nothing happens. Heal the heart first, then let's dialogue. And I want to see when people are ready to build up forgiveness within their own community and then go community to community. And I have actually had a lot of requests for this lately in Africa, in Burundi, Malawi, South Africa. I just had a dialogue today with a gentleman from Nigeria who has asked for forgiveness education programs for families and schools. Okay? There's something about Africa that gets it. And it's, I think, because, and Liberia, we also work in Liberia. And so I would say of any continent in the whole world that really is starting to emerge with the idea of macro forgiveness, it's Africa. And it's surprising me. This gentleman with whom I talked today in Nigeria, I didn't contact him. He contacted me. And that's the same thing in Burundi and Malawi. Something is awakening in Africa that is stunningly beautiful, that they're going to be the first ones through the peace door, merging forgiveness and the quest for justice. And we don't know what's going to happen there because it's new and it's never been tried. But I'd say let's stand back because we might get deeper results, long-lasting results, rather than the cycles of war. See, I talked with a United Nations person who said about every 10 years, conflict zones reawaken to war. Okay, about every decade. I'm thinking if we merge forgiving within your own community first and justice toward the group to group, this cycle of every 10 years is going to end. But we have to try it first. And I'm frustrated beyond belief that it has not happened yet.
Well, I'm astounded to hear, but I'm also not, that we have never contemplated bringing forgiveness into restorative justice or any type of community to community conflict, because clearly what we've been doing has not worked. And we don't get change without change.
Right. See, restorative justice itself has, some people have put forgiveness in, but it's usually in the dyadic dialogue between a victim and an offender. That's not the entire group. See, so restorative justice, I'm really happy that they're doing it. Do work with people to heal hearts first, and then the dialogue might be more fruitful. But how do we kick it up beyond the dialogue between two people? How do we do it with the group that's in conflict with another group, just like you and I have discussed? It's totally possible. We have the materials to help heal the individual hearts and the family hearts and the group hearts, and then try group to group. Why aren't we trying it?
Well, I will tell you, it is my hope that this conversation brings more attention to your heart and your desire to bring some healing and forgiveness to the Middle East, because God knows we need that. And we need to do it there, and then we need to bring it here, because we've got some great divisions in this country, and it seems to be the thing that we all focus on unilaterally instead of opening our hearts and trying to find the things we have in common, which far outweigh the things that we disagree on.
Right. Cooperation rather than competition. Getting along rather than winning. Forgiveness would help us get into that sense of group harmony. And see, that's what the ancient Greeks saw as the epitome of a good community, harmony. And we've lost that. We're really focused on winning and power, and we need to rethink, and forgiveness will help us to rethink.
Dr. Robert Enright, thank you so much for joining me today. How can people learn more about your work?
Well, they can try our International Forgiveness Institute, which we established in 1994, by going to internationalforgiveness.com. We have a lot there. We have a blog, and we have something, I didn't name it this, the president of the organization did, called Ask Dr. Forgiveness. I'm that guy. Okay.
I love that.
Yeah. And then we have news items and the like, and we actually have scales for people to fill out if they wanted to. Forgiveness scales, self-forgiveness, and group forgiveness scales, and they're all free. And we have videos from our different conferences. We've had international conferences in Jerusalem, Rome, and here in Madison, Wisconsin. And they're all professionally produced and online for free.
Well, I'm a fan of you and of your work, and I am grateful for your assistance that I have personally experienced in my own healing journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Darcy.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. This episode was produced by me, Darcy Sterling, with editorial support from Vicky Vergolina. Editing and sound engineering by Bart Migal. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani, Preston Smith, and Stephanie Sterling. If you know someone who is suffering because they are holding a grudge, please share this episode with them. If you have a question or comment, my email is darcy@askdrdarcy.com. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with relationship, dating, and mental health hacks you've come to expect. As always, any references are in the show notes.